Picture this. A storm rages outside, a wild, untamed beast of nature clawing at the world with jagged fingers of wind and rain. The sky is a churning abyss, black as coal, spitting sheets of water that slash against the windows like 1,000 tiny knives. Thunder roars, a deep, guttural bellow that shakes the walls of a small house perched on the edge of Willow Creek, Illinois. Inside, the air is warm, thick with the scent of brewing coffee and the promise of cocoa, a fragile shield against the tempest's fury. But there, on the faded blue couch, a little boy kneels, his small frame dwarfed by the storm's chaos. Ethan Carter, just 5 years old, presses his face to the cold glass, his blonde curls wild, his breath fogging the pain in uneven bursts. His blue eyes, wide, searching, dart across the darkness, chasing something no one else can see. "Someone's crying," he whispers, his voice so soft it's nearly lost beneath the wind's relentless howl. His small hands splay against the window, leaving smudged prints, as if he could reach through the glass and pull that distant plea into the safety of the room. His mother, Lena, glances up from her knitting, a half-finished scarf dangling from her needles, her auburn hair catching the lamplight. She smiles at first. Kids hear all sorts of things in storms, don't they? But there's a tremor in Ethan's tone that makes her pause. "It's just the wind, sweetie," she says, her voice gentle, coaxing. "It's playing tricks on us tonight." From the kitchen, Daniel Carter's voice floats in, steady as ever. "Kettle's on, champ. This one's a monster. 60-mile-an-hour gusts. We're in for it." But Ethan doesn't move. His head tilts, curls bouncing slightly, his gaze locked on the void beyond their tidy yard. "No," he says, sharper now, insistent. "It's not the wind. He's crying, out there. He's scared." The words hang in the air, heavy, piercing through the cozy hum of the house like a needle through fabric. Lena sets her knitting aside, her heart giving a small, unsteady lurch. She crosses the room, kneeling beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. Warm, grounding. "What do you hear, honey?" she asks, searching his pale face. Lightning tears the sky open, a blinding flash that paints the street in stark whites and grays. Empty asphalt, swaying trees, wet gravel glinting like scattered coins. Thunder follows, a bone-rattling crack, and in its wake they hear it, a faint, mournful whimper, threading through the storm like a thread about to snap. Lena's breath catches, her fingers tightening on Ethan. Daniel steps in from the kitchen, mugs forgotten, his tall frame casting a shadow as he joins them at the window. "That's no wind," he says, voice low, eyes narrowing as the sound comes again, sharper, raw, laced with pain and terror. "It's coming from the tracks." Ethan's eyes meet his father's, wide and fierce, a determination blazing through them that no child his age should carry. "He's calling me," he says, his voice trembling but sure. "He needs help." And in that moment, the storm outside becomes more than weather. It becomes a summons, a cry from the edge of something vast and unknowable. Whatever's out there, it's fighting to be heard, and Ethan somehow is answering. The Carter family home nestled on the outskirts of Willow Creek, a sleepy little town in Illinois where the forest stretched its green fingers right up to the rooftops, brushing against shingles with a whisper only the wind could carry. The railway tracks ran parallel to the town's edge, a steel ribbon that hummed with the weight of freight trains rolling through the night, a sound so familiar it had become a lullaby to the residents, a steady heartbeat beneath the quiet. It was late October 2025, and the air outside hung heavy with the scent of damp leaves and the faint chill of frost creeping in from the north. Inside, though, the house was a cocoon of warmth, a sanctuary stitched together with small, everyday comforts that held the world at bay. Lena Carter sat in the living room, her legs tucked beneath her on the worn armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly in a rhythm as old as time itself. A purple scarf spilled from her hands, its uneven rows a labor of love meant for her son, Ethan, a gift to wrap him in her care when winter tightened its grip. Her auburn hair caught the glow of the lamp beside her, strands slipping free from a loose bun to frame her face, softening the lines of worry that sometimes crept into her hazel eyes. She hummed an old lullaby under her breath, one her mother had sung to her years ago, its melody weaving through the room like a thread of memory. It was a quiet night, or it had been, until the storm began to stir, a distant rumble rolling in like a warning she couldn't yet decipher. In the kitchen, Daniel Carter moved with the easy grace of a man who'd built this life with his own hands. His broad shoulders filled the doorway as he rattled mugs onto the counter, the kettle hissing softly on the stove. The scent of brewing coffee mingled with the sweeter promise of cocoa, curling through the air like an invitation to sit, to rest, to let the world spin on without them for a while. "Kettle's on, champ," he called, his voice warm and steady, a bedrock beneath the evening's calm. "Weather app says this one's a monster, 60-mile-an-hour gusts. We're in for a wild ride." He grinned to himself, picturing Ethan's wide-eyed excitement at the thought of a storm. Their boy loved the chaos of it, the way it turned their quiet corner of the world into something alive, something grand. Ethan knelt on the faded blue couch, his small frame pressed against the window, his blonde curls wild and tangled from a day spent chasing shadows in the backyard. At 5 years old, he was a bundle of energy and wonder, his blue eyes always searching, sometimes for bugs in the grass, sometimes for shapes in the clouds, always for something more. Tonight, those eyes were fixed on the darkness beyond their tidy yard, the first raindrops splattering against the glass like tentative knocks from an unseen visitor. He loved storms, always had, watching them unfold like stories written just for him, the lightning a pen, the thunder a voice. His small hands splayed against the pane, leaving smudges Lena would tease him about later, his breath fogging the glass in uneven bursts as he traced the rain's path with his fingertips. "Mom," he whispered, his voice so soft it barely rose above the wind's rising howl. "Someone's crying." The words slipped out, fragile but sharp, cutting through the room's gentle hum like a blade through silk. Lena looked up, her needles pausing mid-stitch, a smile tugging at her lips. Kids and their imaginations, right? "It's just the storm, sweetie," she said, setting her knitting into her lap. "It's playing tricks on us tonight. How about that cocoa to chase the spooks away?" Her tone was light, coaxing, the kind of voice that could soothe a scraped knee or a bad dream. She'd heard him spin tales before, monsters in the closet, fairies in the garden, but there was something in his whisper tonight that made her chest tighten, a flicker of unease she couldn't quite place. Daniel poked his head in from the kitchen, his grin faltering as he caught the shift in the air. "What's that, buddy?" he asked, stepping closer, the mugs forgotten on the counter. Ethan shook his head, curls bouncing, his gaze never leaving the window. "No, it's not the wind," he said, his voice growing firmer, insistent. "He's crying, out there. He's scared." The words hung there, heavy, a weight that pressed against the walls of their safe little world. Lena's smile faded, her hand stilling completely as she watched her son, his pale face, his trembling lip, the way his small body seemed to lean toward whatever he heard beyond the glass. She rose from the chair, crossing the room in a few quick steps, her bare feet silent on the carpet. Kneeling beside him, she rested a hand on his shoulder. Warm, steady, a mother's touch meant to anchor him. "What do you hear, honey?" she asked, her voice softer now, searching his face for answers. Ethan's eyes flicked to hers, wide and fierce, a determination blazing through them that no 5-year-old should carry. "He's out there," he said, his breath quickening. "He's crying for me." Lightning flashed, a jagged tear across the sky, lighting up the street in stark whites and grays. Empty asphalt shimmering with rain, pines bending under the wind's weight, gravel scattered like forgotten promises. Thunder followed, a deep, bone-rattling crack that shook the house, and in its wake, they heard it. a faint, mournful whimper, carried on the storm like a thread about to snap. Lena's breath caught, her fingers tightening on Ethan's shoulder, a chill prickling her skin despite the room's warmth. Daniel stepped fully into the living room now, his shadow stretching across the floor as he joined them at the window, his hazel eyes narrowing as he squinted into the rain. "That's no wind," he said, his voice low, almost a growl as the sound came again, sharper this time, raw, laced with pain and terror. "It's coming from the tracks." The train horn wailed in the distance, long and mournful, weaving through the wind like a ghost's lament, and Ethan's hands balled into fists, pressing harder against the glass. "He's calling me," he said, his voice trembling but sure, as if he'd heard a voice no one else could catch. "He needs help!" The urgency in his tone sliced through the air, a plea that tugged at Lena's heart and set Daniel's jaw tight. She looked at her husband, her worry mirrored in his steady gaze. Ethan was their dreamer, their sensitive soul, but this was different. This was real. The storm outside was no longer just weather. It was a summons, a cry from something or someone fighting to be heard. And Ethan, their little boy with the wild curls and fearless heart, was already answering. Daniel ran a hand through his dark hair, exhaling sharply. "That's an animal," he said, his voice thick with realization. "Something's hurt out there, and too damn close to the tracks." Another flash of lightning lit the room, casting their shadows against the wall, three silhouettes frozen in a moment of decision. Lena's hand slid from Ethan's shoulder to his back, rubbing small circles as she fought the instinct to pull him away from the window, to bundle him up in blankets and pretend the night was still theirs. But that whimper came again, fainter now, more desperate, and Ethan turned to her, his eyes brimming with tears that hadn't yet fallen. "Please, Mommy," he whispered, his voice breaking. "We have to help him." She swallowed hard, her throat tight, and glanced at Daniel again. He nodded, slow and deliberate, the weight of it settling over them both. "All right," he said, zipping up his raincoat with a decisiveness that belied the knot in his stomach. "Lena, grab the flashlight. Ethan, you stick with me. We're checking it out." His words were firm, but his eyes held a flicker of fear. Fear of what they might find, fear of what this night would demand of them. Lena hesitated, her heart thudding against her ribs, but she rose, hurrying to the kitchen drawer where the flashlight lay buried beneath batteries and old receipts. Ethan scrambled off the couch, tugging on his yellow raincoat, too big at the sleeves, a hand-me-down from a cousin, his rain boots slapping the floor as he bounced with urgency. "Hurry, Daddy, hurry!" he kept saying, his small voice a drumbeat driving them forward, his eyes darting back to the window as the rain thickened into sheets. Daniel pulled Ethan close, tucking him under one arm while Lena returned, the flashlight trembling slightly in her grip. They stood there for a heartbeat, a family on the edge of something vast and unknowable, the storm's howl pressing against the walls like a living thing. Whatever was out there, it had called to Ethan, and now it was calling them all. Ethan's face changed in an instant, like a candle flaring to life in a darkened room. His blue eyes widened, the soft glow of the living room draining from his cheeks, replaced by a fierce, trembling fire that seemed too big for his 5-year-old frame. His small hands pressed harder against the window, smudging the glass with desperate fingerprints, as if he could claw his way through to whatever, or whoever, was crying out there in the storm. "He's calling me!" he said, his voice quivering but sharp, cutting through the howling wind like a thread of steel. "He needs help!" The words burst from him, raw and urgent, a plea that sank into Lena's bones and made Daniel's breath catch in his throat. Before Lena could react, Ethan bolted from the couch, his small feet pounding across the carpet with a speed that defied his size. He reached the front door in seconds, a blur of yellow raincoat and wild curls, his hands slamming against the glass panel, leaving foggy smears as he peered into the downpour. "Ethan, wait!" Lena cried, scrambling after him, her knitting tumbling to the floor in a tangle of purple yarn. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands grasping his shoulders, trying to anchor him to the safety of their home. "Sweetheart, it's pouring out there. It's not safe," she said, her voice trembling with a mother's instinct to shield him, to pull him back from the edge of whatever madness had seized him. The rain lashed the house in relentless waves, the wind rattling the windows like a beast demanding entry, and all she wanted was to bundle him up, to tuck him under blankets and drown out the night with cocoa and soft words. But Ethan turned to her, his eyes locking with hers, and what she saw there stole the air from her lungs. Those blue depths burned with something ancient, something fierce, a determination that no child should carry, a resolve that seemed to reach beyond the storm, beyond their little world in Willow Creek. "He's scared, Mom," he said, his voice breaking, tears glistening but not falling. "I hear him. He's crying for me." His small hands balled into fists, trembling against the door, and in that moment, he wasn't just her little boy anymore. He was a soul answering a call she couldn't hear, couldn't understand. Another whimper pierced the air, fainter now but more desperate, a sound that clawed at Lena's chest and left her gasping, her fingers tightening on him as if she could hold him back from whatever pulled him forward. Daniel crossed the room in 3 long strides, his raincoat half-zipped, his shadow stretching across the carpet as he joined them at the door. He'd heard it too, that mournful cry weaving through the storm, threading between the thunder's growls and the rain's hiss. "That's an animal," he said, his voice low and urgent, his hazel eyes narrowing as he squinted into the darkness beyond their porch. "Something's hurt, and too damn close to the tracks." The train horn wailed again, closer now, its long, mournful note tangling with the wind, sending a shiver down Lena's spine. She'd grown up with those tracks, their steady rumble a constant in her life. But tonight, that sound carried a weight she couldn't shake, a promise of danger rolling toward them on steel rails. Ethan's head snapped up, his curls bouncing as he turned to his father, his small body trembling with purpose. "Please, Daddy," he pleaded, his voice cracking, tears welling in his eyes but held back by sheer will. "We have to help him." The words were a dagger, slicing through the cozy shield of their home, and Lena felt her heart twist, half with fear, half with awe. Ethan was their dreamer, their sensitive soul who cried over stepped-on flowers and whispered to the stars. But this was different. This was a need, a pull so deep it seemed to come from somewhere beyond him, beyond them all. Lena looked at Daniel, her worry mirrored in the tight lines of his face, the way his jaw clenched as he processed their son's plea. She wanted to say no, to lock the door and wait out the storm with the curtains drawn. But that cry came again, sharper, raw, a thread of pain and terror that tugged at her soul. Daniel's gaze softened as it met hers, a silent conversation passing between them in the space of a heartbeat. They'd built this life together, nights like this, with Coco and knitting and Ethan's laughter, but they'd also built it on love, on trust, on the unspoken promise to face the hard things as a family. And Ethan's certainty, his unshakable resolve, tipped the scales. "All right," Daniel said, zipping his raincoat fully, his voice steady despite the knot tightening in his stomach. Lena grabbed the flashlight. "Ethan, you stick with me. We're checking it out." The decision landed like a stone, heavy and final, and Lena's breath hitched, her hands still resting on Ethan's shoulders. She hesitated, her heart thudding against her ribs, every instinct screaming to keep him inside, to keep them all safe. But Daniel's eyes held hers, steady and sure, and she knew he felt it too. That whatever was out there, it wasn't just an animal in trouble. It was something more, something that had reached into their home and wrapped its desperate fingers around their son's heart. She rose, her legs shaky, and hurried to the kitchen, her bare feet silent on the tile as she yanked open the drawer. The flashlight was buried beneath a jumble of batteries, old receipts, and a screwdriver. A relic from summer camping trips, its beam a promise of light in the dark. Her hands trembled as she clutched it, the cold metal grounding her as she turned back to the living room. Ethan was already tugging on his yellow raincoat, the sleeves too long, flapping over his hands as he pulled on his rain boots, small blue ones with cartoon fish that slapped the floor with every step. "Hurry, Daddy, hurry!" he kept saying, his voice a drumbeat of urgency, his eyes darting to the window where the rain had thickened into a curtain, blurring the world beyond. Daniel scooped Ethan into one arm, the boy's small body warm against his chest, the umbrella in his other hand flapping uselessly as he opened the back door. The storm hit them like a wall, icy rain stinging their faces, wind tearing at their clothes, a wild force that seemed to roar with impatience. Lena followed, the flashlight's beam wobbling in her grip as she stepped into the backyard, mud sucking at her sneakers with every step. The gate creaked as they pushed through, the forest looming ahead, a dripping wall of pines and tangled undergrowth, its shadows swaying under the storm's wrath. "That way," Ethan pointed, his small arms steady despite the chaos, guiding them toward a break in the trees where the railway embankment rose like a scar across the land. The ground was slick, treacherous, their boots slipping as they pressed forward, driven by that cry, louder now, broken, a sound that twisted Lena's insides and made Daniel's grip tighten on Ethan. The embankment came into view, a steep slope of gravel and weeds, the steel rails glistening wet under flashes of lightning. Thunder rolled overhead, a deep growl that shook the earth, and the train horn blared again, closer, insistent, a warning they couldn't ignore. Lena's breath came in short gasps, her free hand reaching for Daniel's arm, needing the reassurance of his solidity as they climbed, the wind whipping her hair into her face. Ethan wriggled in Daniel's grasp, his small voice rising above the storm. "He's there!" he shouted, pointing down the tracks, his curls plastered to his forehead by rain. "He's scared! I hear him!" The cry came again, piercing the night, a sound so raw it felt like a physical thing clawing at their hearts. Daniel set Ethan down, his hands steadying the boy as they crested the embankment, the flashlight's beam cutting through the murk to reveal the unknown ahead. Lena's pulse hammered in her ears, fear and love warring within her. Fear of what they'd find. Love for the little boy who'd pulled them into this storm with a courage she couldn't fathom. They stood there, a family bound by a call they couldn't refuse, the rain soaking through their clothes, the wind howling around them like a chorus of restless spirits. Whatever was out there, it was fighting to be heard, its life hanging by a thread, and Ethan, their wild-haired, fearless child, was leading them to it, step by trembling step. The storm roared around them as they crested the embankment, a wild symphony of wind and rain that battered their bodies and drowned their senses. Lena's breath came in ragged gasps, her sneakers slipping on the wet gravel, the flashlight trembling in her grip as she fought to keep pace with Daniel and Ethan. The air was thick with the scent of soaked earth and pine, the forest's edge looming behind them like a dark, watchful giant. Thunder growled overhead, a low rumble that vibrated through their bones, and lightning slashed the sky, casting the railway tracks in a stark, fleeting glow. Two steel lines stretching into the night, cold and unyielding. Ethan's small hand pointed down the tracks, his yellow raincoat a splash of color against the gray, his voice rising above the chaos. "He's there!" The urgency in his cry cut through the storm, a beacon pulling them forward, and Lena felt her heart lurch, half with fear, half with a fierce, protective love that burned brighter than the lightning itself. They stumbled onward, the ground slick and treacherous, mud sucking at their boots as they followed Ethan's lead. The cry came again, louder now, broken, a sound that twisted Lena's insides into knots and made Daniel's jaw clench tight. It wasn't just a whimper anymore. It was a plea, a raw thread of pain and terror that seemed to reach inside them and pull, demanding they answer. Lena's flashlight beam wobbled, slicing through the rain-soaked murk, and then it steadied, catching on something 30 feet down the tracks that stopped them dead in their tracks. The world seemed to freeze, the storm's roar fading to a distant hum, as the light revealed a sight that sucked the air from their lungs and turned their blood to ice. There, sprawled across the gravel between the rails, lay a German shepherd, its black and tan fur soaked and matted with mud and blood. its massive frame trembling in the cold. Thick, rusted chains bound its neck and front legs, wrapped cruelly around the steel rail, the metal biting deep into its flesh with every shuddering breath. Its eyes gleamed wild in the flashlight's beam, huge dark pools of terror and pain, reflecting the light like shattered glass as it strained against the bonds. Each tug tightened the chains, drawing thin rivulets of blood that mingled with the rain, pooling in the gravel beneath it. The dog's head lifted slightly, a low, broken whine escaping its throat, a sound so raw, so desperate that it felt like a physical blow to Lena's chest. "Oh my God," she gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, the flashlight shaking as tears blurred her vision. Her knees buckled, the weight of the sight threatening to drag her down into the mud. But she held herself upright, her free hand reaching blindly for Daniel. He stood frozen beside her, his hazel eyes wide with horror, his breath coming in sharp bursts as he took in the scene. This wasn't an accident. Someone had done this, had chained this creature here to die. And the realization hit him like a punch to the gut, bile rising in his throat. "He's trapped," Ethan cried, his voice piercing the stunned silence, and before they could stop him, he wriggled free from Daniel's arm, sliding down the slope in a splash of mud and water. "Ethan, no!" Daniel shouted, lunging after him, his boots slipping on the gravel as he scrambled to catch up. Lena's heart leapt into her throat, a scream rising but dying on her lips as she watched her son, her tiny, fearless boy, race toward the dog with a speed that defied his size. He dropped to his knees beside it, his yellow raincoat pooling around him in the muck, his small hands hovering over the trembling animal as if afraid to touch, afraid to hurt. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice steady despite the tears streaking his rain-slicked face, mixing with the droplets that clung to his curls. "I heard you. I'm here." The German shepherd stilled for a heartbeat, its frantic struggles pausing as it met Ethan's gaze, its dark eyes locking with his blue ones. A soft whine slipped from its throat, weaker now but laced with something like trust, like it recognized him, like it had been waiting for him all along. Daniel reached them, dropping to his knees beside Ethan, his hands fumbling over the chains in a desperate bid to free the dog. The metal was cold and slick, rusted links biting into his palms as he pulled, blood welling from shallow cuts where the edges caught his skin. "We need something to cut this! I can't break it!" he yelled, his voice hoarse with panic, his eyes darting over the padlock that secured the chains, solid, unyielding, a cruel lock on a life slipping away. The dog's breathing was shallow, its massive chest heaving with effort, each exhale a faint whimper that tore at Daniel's resolve. He tugged harder, his muscles straining, but the chains held fast, mocking his efforts with their silent strength. Lena slid down the slope to join them, her sneakers skidding in the gravel, her flashlight shaking as she knelt beside the dog. "Who would do this?" she choked out, her voice breaking, horror trembling in every syllable as she took in the full scope of the cruelty before her. The chains weren't just restraints, they were a death sentence, wrapped tight enough to choke, to crush, the rust stained with fresh blood where they'd cut into the dog's neck and legs. Older scars crisscrossed its flank. Burns, gashes, marks of a life lived under someone's merciless hand. And Lena's stomach twisted, tears spilling freely now as she reached out, her fingers brushing the matted fur. The dog flinched at her touch, then relaxed, its pleading eyes darting between them. Ethan, Daniel, her, searching for salvation in their faces. The train horn blared again, closer now, its mournful wail cutting through the storm like a blade, and the ground beneath their knees buzzed with the faint vibration of its approach. "We're out of time!" Daniel shouted, his voice cracking as he staggered to his feet, the rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead. "Get Ethan back. I'll try to flag the train." He waved his arms toward the oncoming lights, a desperate silhouette against the storm, his raincoat flapping as he stepped onto the tracks, shouting into the wind. The headlights pierced the darkness, a white glare growing brighter with every second, the horn a continuous scream that drowned his voice, his pleas. "No!" Ethan sobbed, wrapping his small arms around the dog's neck, his tears falling onto its blood-streaked fur. "I won't leave him, I promised." His voice was a wail, a child's defiance against a world too big, too cruel. And Lena lunged for him, her hands grasping his shoulders as she tried to pull him away. "Ethan, please!" she begged, her voice breaking, her own tears mixing with the rain as she fought to drag him to safety. But he clung tighter, his small body trembling with sobs, his face buried in the dog's matted coat. The headlights flared, blinding now, bathing them in a harsh, unrelenting light, and the train's roar swallowed everything. The wind, the thunder, Lena's screams as it barreled toward them, unstoppable. In that frozen moment, Ethan threw himself over the dog, his tiny frame a shield against the steel beast, his raincoat flapping like a flag of surrender and defiance all at once. "Ethan!" Lena's scream tore from her throat, a sound so primal it seemed to shake the earth. But it was lost in the train's deafening roar as Daniel lunged forward, his fingers grazing Ethan's coat. Too late, too slow. His heart a hammer in his chest as the world narrowed to this single, unbearable second. The gravel crunched beneath his boots, his breath a ragged prayer. And then, a shadow burst from the trees, a figure cloaked in rain and urgency, a pair of bolt cutters glinting in his hands like a lifeline. The stranger moved with a speed born of desperation, his hood slipping back to reveal a weathered face, dark eyes blazing with purpose. A sharp snap cracked the air, the bolt cutters slicing through the chain like a guillotine through rope, and the metal fell slack, clattering to the gravel. Daniel's hands found Ethan's coat, yanking him and the dog off the tracks in one frantic pull, his arms wrapping around them as they tumbled into the mud. The train thundered past, a wall of steel and noise that shook the ground and sent a gust of wind slamming into them, knocking them flat against the embankment. Its wheels screeched, sparks flying where metal met metal, and then it was gone, its red taillights fading into the storm's embrace, leaving them gasping in its wake. They lay there, sprawled in the gravel, hearts pounding, breath coming in sharp, painful bursts. Ethan clung to the dog, his sobs muffled against its trembling form, while Lena crawled to them, her hands shaking as she pulled her son into her arms, her tears falling onto his curls. Daniel knelt beside them, his hands bloody and trembling, his eyes locked on the stranger who'd appeared from nowhere to save them. The man dropped to one knee, his chest heaving, rain dripping from his stubbled jaw as he tossed the bolt cutters aside. "We need to move, now," he said, his voice rough as gravel, cutting through the stunned silence. "That dog needs help, and they're coming for us." Lena clutched Ethan tighter, her sobs mixing with the rain, her mind reeling as she tried to process the words. Daniel's gaze darted between the stranger and the dog, shivering, bleeding, but alive, and 1,000 questions burned in his throat, each one sharper than the last. Who was this man? Who were they? But one look at the German shepherd, its dark eyes flickering with a fading light, told him there was no time to ask, no time to hesitate. Whatever they'd stumbled into, whatever nightmare had chained this creature to the tracks, it wasn't over. The storm raged on, its howl a relentless chorus, and beneath it, a darker threat loomed, one they couldn't outrun with prayers or tears. The storm's roar faded to a dull, persistent hum as the train's taillights vanished into the night, leaving the Carter family sprawled in the gravel, their breaths ragged and sharp against the rain's steady patter. Daniel clutched Ethan to his chest, the boy's small body trembling with sobs, his yellow raincoat smeared with mud and blood, some his own from scraped knees, some from the dog he'd shielded with his life. Lena crawled through the muck to reach them, her hands shaking as she pulled Ethan into her arms, her tears falling hot and fast onto his curls, mingling with the cold rain that soaked them through. The German shepherd lay beside them, its massive frame shivering violently, the severed chain still dangling from its neck like a cruel relic of its torment. Its dark eyes flickered, half open, watching them with a quiet, fading trust that pierced Lena's heart like a shard of glass. Daniel's hands shook as he steadied himself, blood dripping from the cuts on his palms where the rusted chains had bitten deep. His gaze darted to the stranger who knelt beside them, chest heaving, rain streaking down his weathered face. The man's hood had fallen back, revealing a lean figure in his mid-30s. Dark eyes shadowed with exhaustion, a stubbled jaw clenched tight, a pair of bolt cutters glinting wet in the gravel where he'd tossed them. "Who are you?" Daniel demanded, his voice hoarse, suspicion warring with the gratitude that flooded his veins. The stranger had saved them, saved Ethan, saved the dog. But the urgency in his tone, the way his eyes flicked to the trees as if expecting shadows to lunge, set Daniel's nerves on edge. The man didn't look up at first, his hands moving gently over the dog's trembling form, probing the gashes where the chain had cut deepest. "Name's Joel Mercer," he said finally, his voice rough as the gravel beneath them, steady despite the tremor in his breath. "This is Bruno. Best damn dog I ever trained. And the people who did this? They're not done yet." His fingers paused on a wound, blood seeping through the matted fur, and he cursed under his breath, a low, bitter sound that carried the weight of too many sleepless nights. "Trained?" Lena's voice quavered, her arms tightening around Ethan as she stared at Joel, her hazel eyes wide with confusion and dread. She shifted closer to Bruno, her fingers brushing his soaked coat, feeling the faint rise and fall of his chest beneath her touch. The dog whimpered softly, his head tilting toward her, and she swallowed hard, fighting the sob that clawed at her throat. "What do you mean? Who would chain a dog to a train track?" The question hung in the air, heavy with horror, and she looked down at Bruno, his scars, his burns, the fresh blood staining the gravel, and felt a wave of nausea rise, her mind reeling at the cruelty etched into his body. Joel's jaw tightened, his dark eyes meeting hers for a fleeting moment before dropping back to Bruno, his hands resuming their careful work. "Carter Voss," he said, the name falling like a stone into the silence, cold and unyielding. "My old boss. Runs a private security outfit, more crime ring than company. Bruno was his star prospect until 3 days ago. Refused to attack a target, a girl they'd kidnapped to extort her father. Voss doesn't forgive defiance. Ordered him killed, but they wanted it slow. Poetic, he called it." The words were clipped, edged with a bitterness that spoke of betrayal, of a man who'd seen too much and carried it like a weight on his soul. "That's sick," Daniel spat, his voice thick with disgust, his arms tightening around Ethan as if he could shield him from the ugliness of Joel's words. The boy had gone quiet, his sobs easing into shuddering breaths, his small hand reaching out from Lena's embrace to rest on Bruno's muzzle. The dog's eyes flickered open at the touch, dark and deep, locking with Ethan's blue ones, and a faint whine escaped his throat, soft, pleading, a sound that twisted Daniel's gut into knots. He couldn't fathom it, couldn't wrap his mind around someone chaining a living creature to die like that, let alone a dog who'd chosen mercy over violence. "We need to get him warm," Joel said, his tone shifting to practicality as he slid his arms beneath Bruno's massive frame, lifting him with a grunt. The dog was heavy, his body limp with exhaustion, and Joel's muscles strained under the weight, rain dripping from his sleeves as he cradled him close. "He's lost too much blood. Your house close?" His eyes flicked to Lena, then Daniel, a silent plea beneath the command, and Lena nodded, her voice shaking as she pointed back through the trees. "Back through the forest, just past the gate," she said, her breath hitching. "But if they're after you—" "They'll find us," Joel cut in, his tone flat, final, as if stating a fact as inevitable as the storm itself. "Which is why we can't stay long." He adjusted his grip on Bruno, the dog's head lolling against his shoulder, and started down the embankment, his boots crunching in the gravel. Daniel scooped Ethan up again, the boy's small body warm against his chest, despite the chill, and followed, his mind racing with questions he didn't have time to voice. Lena stumbled after them, clutching the flashlight, its beam wobbling as they slogged back through the mud, the storm unrelenting in its fury. The trek back was a blur of rain and wind, the forest swallowing them in its dripping embrace as they pushed through the gate, their clothes soaked through, their breaths clouding in the cold. The kitchen light glowed like a beacon through the back door, a promise of shelter that felt fragile against the weight of Joel's warning. They stumbled inside, water pooling on the tile, and Lena cleared the kitchen table in a frantic sweep, pushing aside a bowl of apples, a stack of bills, anything to make space. Joel laid Bruno down gently, the towels Lena piled beneath him soaking red almost instantly, the harsh light revealing the full extent of his wounds. Deep gashes from the chain, older burns and scars crisscrossing his flank like a map of suffering. "He's been through hell," Joel muttered, his hands steady despite the tremor in his voice as he pressed a towel to a bleeding gash. Ethan wriggled free from Daniel's arms, climbing onto a chair beside the table, his small hand stroking Bruno's muzzle with a tenderness that broke Lena's heart all over again. "Wake up, Bruno," he whispered, his voice soft but sure, as if he could will the dog back from the edge with words alone. "You're safe now." Bruno's eyes flickered open briefly, meeting Ethan's, and his tail thumped once, weak, deliberate, a faint spark of life that made Lena's breath catch, her hands hovering uselessly as she watched her son and this broken creature forge a bond she couldn't explain. Daniel turned to Joel, his suspicion giving way to a raw, reluctant gratitude. "You risked your life for this dog. Why?" he asked, his voice low, searching the stranger's face for answers. Joel didn't look up, his fingers probing a wound with a care that spoke of years spent tending to this animal. "I trained him from a pup," he said, his tone quiet but firm. "He's not just a dog, he's a soul. Voss wanted him broken, turned into a weapon, but Bruno wouldn't bend. He'd sense fear, real fear, and he'd stop. That girl they wanted him to attack, she was terrified, crying. Bruno laid down at her feet instead of lunging. I couldn't let them win, not after that." Lena's hand paused on Bruno's fur, her eyes welling as she looked at Joel, really looked at him, and saw the exhaustion etched into his features, the shadows of a fight he'd been waging alone. "That's not failure," she said, her voice breaking, tears slipping down her cheeks as she traced a burn scar with trembling fingers. "That's humanity." Joel's lips twitched, a faint, bitter smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Try telling Voss that," he replied, his voice laced with a weariness that went bone deep. "He thrives on control. Dogs, people, doesn't matter. I was gathering evidence against him. Client lists, videos, proof of his dirty deals. Was gonna take it to the feds next week, but then this happened." Bruno whined, shifting slightly under their hands, his dark eyes fluttering open to find Ethan again, and Joel's jaw tightened. "He's tough," he said, pressing a fresh towel to the wound. "Infection's setting in, but he's a fighter, always was." Ethan leaned closer, his curls dripping onto the table, his small hand never leaving Bruno's muzzle. "He called me," he whispered, his voice trembling with a certainty that sent a chill down Lena's spine. "He was so scared, but he knew I'd come." Daniel exchanged a glance with Lena, unsettled, awed, their son's words echoing in the space between them like a truth they couldn't grasp. Ethan had always been sensitive, attuned to things they couldn't see, but this was different, deeper, stranger, a thread tying him to Bruno that defied logic. Joel paused, a bloody rag dripping in his hand, his dark eyes flicking to Ethan with a mix of curiosity and something softer. Recognition, maybe, or respect. "How'd you know his name, kid?" he asked, his voice quiet, probing. Ethan shrugged, his fingers tracing Bruno's ear with a gentleness that belied his age. "I just do," he said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "He told me." The room fell silent, the storm's howl a distant murmur against the weight of his words. And Lena felt a shiver run through her, not from the cold, but from the mystery of her son, the boy who'd heard a cry no one else could and answered it with his whole heart. The kitchen glowed with a warm amber light as the storm raged on outside, its relentless howl muffled by the walls of the Carter home, a sanctuary that felt more like a borrowed breath than a stronghold. Water pooled on the tile floor, dripping from their soaked clothes, a silent testament to the chaos they'd just escaped. Lena's hands trembled as she spread towels across the table, their soft white fibers staining red almost instantly beneath Bruno's battered form. Joel worked with a quiet precision beside her, his rough hands steady as he cleaned the German Shepherd's wounds with antiseptic from the first aid kit, the sharp scent cutting through the lingering aroma of coffee and cocoa that had once defined this space. Daniel darted to the sink, filling a bowl with warm water, his movements quick but unsteady, his mind still reeling from the tracks, from the stranger's words, from the blood on his son's raincoat. Ethan perched on a chair beside the table, his small legs dangling, his yellow raincoat discarded in a muddy heap by the door. His curls clung to his forehead, wet and wild, but his blue eyes were fixed on Bruno with a focus that seemed to hold the world at bay. He reached out, his small hand resting gently on the dog's muzzle, stroking the damp fur with a tenderness that made Lena's chest ache. The German Shepherd's eyes flickered open at the touch, dark and deep, meeting Ethan's gaze with a softness that belied the pain etched into his body. His tail thumped once, weak, deliberate, a faint pulse of life against the towels, and a soft whine escaped his throat, a sound so fragile it seemed to hang in the air like a whispered promise. They worked in a tense, unspoken rhythm, Joel and Lena dabbing at the gashes with antiseptic-soaked rags, Daniel rinsing mud from Bruno's matted fur with warm water that ran red down the table's edge. The harsh kitchen light cast stark shadows, illuminating the dog's wounds in brutal detail. Deep cuts where the chain had bitten, older scars and burns that told a story of suffering no animal should endure. Lena's breath hitched as she traced a burn mark with a trembling finger, the raised, puckered skin a silent accusation against the cruelty Joel had described. Her tears had dried, replaced by a quiet, burning resolve to help this creature who'd called to her son, who'd somehow woven himself into their lives in the span of a single, shattering night. "He's tough," Joel said, his voice low as he threaded a needle from the first aid kit, his hands steady despite the exhaustion lining his face. "Infection's setting in, but he's a fighter, always was." He began stitching a gash on Bruno's flank, the needle piercing the skin with a precision born of practice, and Bruno whimpered softly, his body tensing. Ethan leaned closer, his small hand never leaving the dog's muzzle, his voice a whisper against the storm's distant growl. "It's okay, Bruno," he said, his tone steady, soothing. "You're safe now." The dog's eyes fluttered, locking with Ethan's, and his trembling eased as if the boy's words were a balm stronger than any medicine. "His name's Bruno," Ethan said suddenly, his voice carrying a certainty that made the adults pause, the air in the room shifting with the weight of it. "He told me." Joel froze, a bloody rag dripping in his hand, his dark eyes flicking to Ethan with a mix of surprise and something deeper, recognition, perhaps, or awe. "How'd you know that, kid?" he asked, his tone quiet, probing, as if testing the edges of a mystery he couldn't quite grasp. Ethan shrugged, his fingers tracing Bruno's ear with a gentleness that belied his age. "I just do," he said simply, his blue eyes meeting Joel's without a trace of doubt. "He called me. He was so scared." Lena and Daniel exchanged a glance across the table, their faces shadowed with a shared unease, a quiet wonder that settled over them like a fog. Ethan had always been sensitive, catching moods they missed, hearing whispers in the wind. But this was different, deeper, a connection that defied the boundaries of logic and reason. Lena's hand paused on Bruno's fur, her hazel eyes searching her son's face, and she felt a shiver run through her. not from the cold seeping through her wet clothes, but from the inexplicable bond she saw unfolding before her. Daniel set the bowl of water aside, his bloody hands gripping the counter as he watched Ethan and Bruno, their silent communion a thread tying them together in ways he couldn't understand. Joel resumed his stitching, his movements slower now, his voice dropping to a murmur as he spoke, as if reluctant to break the spell. "He was bred from champion lines," he said, his words weaving a story into the quiet. "Trained for protection, guard work, tracking, the whole deal. But he had this empathy Voss couldn't stomach. He'd sense fear, real fear, not the staged stuff we used in drills. That girl they wanted him to attack? She was terrified, crying her eyes out. Bruno didn't lunge. He laid down at her feet, wouldn't move no matter how much they yelled. Voss lost it, called him a failure, a waste." His lips twisted, a bitter edge creeping into his tone. "But that's not failure. That's something more. That's humanity," Lena said, her voice breaking as she dabbed antiseptic on a burn, her tears welling again despite her efforts to hold them back. She looked at Bruno, his scars, his trembling strength, and felt a surge of admiration, of sorrow, for a creature who'd chosen mercy over violence in a world that punished it. Joel nodded, a faint flicker of agreement in his dark eyes. "Try telling Voss that," he replied, his voice laced with a weariness that went bone deep. "He thrives on control. Dogs, people, doesn't matter. I was gathering evidence against him. Client lists, videos, proof of his dirty deals. Was going to take it to the feds next week, but then this happened." Bruno whined, shifting slightly under their hands, his dark eyes finding Ethan again, and Joel's jaw tightened, his stitching pausing as he pressed a hand to the dog's side, feeling the faint thud of his heartbeat. "We need to move him soon," he said, his tone shifting to urgency. "Voss's men will check the tracks, find the chain cut. They'll come looking." Daniel straightened, his hands clenching into fists, dread pooling in his gut like cold water. "To our house?" he asked, his voice thick with the realization that their sanctuary was no longer safe, that the nightmare they'd stumbled into had followed them home. Joel nodded, his gaze steady, unflinching. "They'll start close, houses near the railway. We've got hours, maybe less." The words landed like a blow, stripping away the fragile warmth of the kitchen, and Lena's breath caught, her hand tightening on Bruno's fur as if she could anchor them all to this moment, this fleeting pause before the storm broke anew. Ethan's head tilted, his small brow furrowing as he looked at Joel, then back to Bruno, his voice a whisper. "They won't take you," he said, his hand pressing harder against the dog's muzzle, a promise carved in the innocence of his 5-year-old heart. A sharp knock at the front door shattered the quiet, a sound so sudden, so jarring, that it felt like the house itself flinched. Everyone froze. Lena's hand mid-motion, Joel's needle poised above Bruno's skin, Daniel's breath stilled in his chest. Bruno's ears twitched, a low growl rumbling deep in his throat, his dark eyes narrowing as he lifted his head, weak but alert. Ethan's hand stilled on the dog's muzzle, his blue eyes widening with a fear that mirrored Lena's own. Joel slid to the window, his movements silent, predatory, as he peered through the blinds, his body tensing like a coiled spring. "Black SUV, tinted windows," he whispered, his voice a blade cutting through the silence. "Not neighbors." "They're here," Lena breathed, her voice barely audible, her arms pulling Ethan close, his small frame trembling against her as the reality crashed over them. Daniel's heart hammered, his hands clenching and unclenching as he looked at Joel, at Bruno, at his family, his world, now teetering on the edge of something dark and unstoppable. "Back door," Joel said, scooping Bruno up despite the dog's size, his arms straining as he cradled him close, blood seeping through the towels onto his shirt. "We go now." Lena's legs shook as she stood, Ethan clinging to her hand, his small face pale but resolute, his eyes locked on Bruno as if he could will the dog to safety with his gaze alone. Daniel grabbed the flashlight from the counter, his mind racing. Where could they go? How could they outrun this? But there was no time to think, only to move. The knock came again, harder, insistent, a demand that echoed through the house like a death knell. The storm outside howled on, a relentless witness to their flight, and as they slipped toward the back door, Lena cast one last glance at the kitchen. Their haven, their home, knowing they might never see it the same way again. The back door creaked open, a sliver of cold night spilling into the kitchen as the storm's howl rushed to greet them. A wild, untamed force that seemed to claw at their resolve. Lena's heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drumbeat as she clutched Ethan's small hand, his fingers trembling but firm in her grasp. The warmth of their home slipped away with every step, replaced by the icy sting of rain and the wind's relentless tug at their soaked clothes. Joel led the way, Bruno cradled in his arms, the German shepherd's massive frame limp but alive, his blood seeping through the towels onto Joel's shirt, staining it dark in the dim light. Daniel followed close behind, the flashlight clutched in one hand, its beam a shaky lifeline cutting through the murk as they slipped into the side yard, the storm masking their footsteps with its ceaseless roar. The garage loomed ahead, a detached shadow 30 yards from the house, its weathered siding a promise of shelter, or a trap, Lena couldn't tell which. Her sneakers sank into the mud, each step a battle against the sucking earth, and she pulled Ethan closer, his yellow raincoat flapping like a broken wing in the wind. "Stay with me, baby," she whispered, her voice lost to the storm, but his small nod told her he'd heard, his blue eyes wide and fixed on Bruno ahead. Joel reached the garage first, easing Bruno's weight against his chest as he nodded to Daniel, who fumbled with his keys, the metal cold and slick in his trembling hands. The side door clicked open, a hollow sound swallowed by the rain, and they stumbled inside, the air thick with the scent of gasoline and damp wood, a fleeting refuge from the chaos outside. "Get in," Daniel hissed, his voice tight with urgency as he shoved open the back of their old Toyota RAV4, the cargo area a cramped haven for their flight. Lena lifted Ethan into the back seat, her arms shaking as she buckled him in, his small body trembling against the cold leather. Joel laid Bruno in the cargo space, the dog's shallow breaths fogging the air, his dark eyes half open, watching Ethan with a quiet, unwavering trust that tore at Lena's heart. Joel climbed in beside him, his knees pressed against the seats, his hands steadying Bruno as blood soaked the mat beneath them. The SUV's engine purred outside, gravel crunching under tires as Voss's men circled the house, hunters closing in, their presence a shadow creeping closer with every heartbeat. Daniel slid into the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wheel as he yanked the garage door upward, manual, silent, a small mercy in their desperate bid to escape. He gunned the engine, the RAV4 lurching forward through the backfield, headlights off to cloak them in darkness, the uneven ground jolting them with every rut. Gunshots cracked behind them, sharp and sudden, a bullet pinging off the bumper with a metallic screech that made Lena's breath catch. "Down!" Joel shouted, his voice a whip cutting through the chaos, and he threw himself over Bruno, shielding the dog as Lena yanked Ethan below the window, her arms wrapping around him like a shield. The boy's small hands clutched her sleeve, his face pressed against her chest, but his eyes stayed on Bruno, a silent plea shimmering in their blue depths. The RAV4 swerved onto a dirt road, tires spinning in the mud, the storm's fury a cloak around them as Voss's black Escalade roared in pursuit, its headlights slashing through the rain like predatory eyes. "Which way?" Daniel yelled, his knuckles white on the wheel, his voice raw with panic as he glanced at Joel in the rearview mirror. "Left, then second right," Joel barked, his tone steady despite the chaos, his arms braced around Bruno to keep him from sliding. "We need back roads, lose them in the forest." The car veered left, mud spraying against the windows, the wipers slapping uselessly against the deluge as they plunged deeper into the night, the Escalade's lights flickering in the distance, a relentless shadow they couldn't shake. For 30 agonizing minutes, they wove through a labyrinth of rural tracks, the forest closing in around them like a living wall, pines bending under the wind, branches scraping the car's sides with skeletal fingers. Daniel's hands ached, his eyes darting between the road and the mirror, the Escalade's lights growing fainter with every turn, every twist of the wheel. Lena held Ethan tight, her whispers a steady stream against his ear. We're okay. Though her own heart raced with a fear she couldn't voice. Bruno whimpered in the back, his blood pooling on the cargo mat, his shallow breaths a faint rhythm beneath the engine's growl, but his eyes stayed on Ethan. Steady, trusting, a silent anchor in the storm's chaos. Ethan reached out, his small hand stretching toward Bruno, his fingers brushing the dog's paw through the gap between the seats. Hold on, Bruno, he whispered, his voice trembling but fierce, a promise carved in the innocence of his 5-year-old soul. The dog's tail thumped once, weak but deliberate, and Lena felt tears sting her eyes. Not from the cold, not from the fear, but from the bond she saw between them, a thread of love and loyalty that defied the darkness closing in. Joel glanced at Ethan, his dark eyes softening for a fleeting moment, a flicker of awe beneath the exhaustion etched into his face. He's fighting for you, kid, he murmured, his hand pressing a towel to Bruno's side, the fabric soaking red as he tried to stem the bleeding. Finally, Daniel turned onto a hidden trail, the path so narrow the branches clawed at the RAV4's sides, the tires sinking into the soft earth as the forest swallowed them whole. Here, Joel said, his voice cutting through the tension as he pointed to a clearing ahead. A rustic cabin emerged from the shadows, peeling paint, a sagging porch, a safe house Joel had bought under a false name, off the grid and buried in the wilderness. We're safe, for now. Daniel killed the engine, the sudden silence deafening after the chase, the storm's howl a distant murmur beyond the trees. They stumbled out, legs shaky, breath clouding in the cold as Joel lifted Bruno from the cargo area, his arms trembling under the weight, the dog's blood dripping onto the muddy ground. Lena carried Ethan, his small body warm against her chest, his arms wrapped around her neck as they hurried inside, the cabin's door creaking shut behind them. The interior was sparse, wood stove, cots, a shelf of canned goods, but it was dry, a fragile cocoon against the night. Joel laid Bruno by the stove, its faint warmth a flicker of hope as he knelt beside him, his hands deft despite the exhaustion pulling at his frame. He pulled a vet kit from a duffel bag, stitching the worst wounds with a needle and thread, his movements mechanical but tender, his breath hitching as Bruno whined softly under his touch. Ethan slid from Lena's arms, curling beside the dog on the floor, his small hand resting on Bruno's neck, whispering reassurances. You're okay, Bruno. We made it. His voice a lifeline in the dim light. Daniel sank onto a cot, his hands bloody and trembling, his eyes locked on his family, Lena hovering near Ethan, Ethan beside Bruno, Joel stitching with a focus that belied the chaos they'd fled. How long? He asked, his voice rough, the question hanging heavy in the air. Joel didn't look up, his needle piercing Bruno's skin as he answered, Hours, maybe. They'll regroup, track us if they can, but this place, it's hidden, gives us a chance. His words were a thin thread of reassurance, frayed at the edges, and Daniel nodded, though the knot in his gut tightened, the weight of their flight pressing against his ribs. Lena knelt beside Ethan, her hand brushing his curls, her hazel eyes tracing the lines of Bruno's battered form. The dog's breathing was shallow, his dark eyes half closed, but they flickered open to find Ethan's, a quiet trust shimmering in their depths. He saved us, she whispered, her voice breaking as she looked at Joel, at Daniel, at the small boy who'd pulled them into this nightmare with a courage she couldn't fathom. Ethan nodded, his fingers tightening on Bruno's fur, his small face pale but resolute. He knew I'd come, he said, his voice soft but sure, a truth that settled over them like a blanket, warm and heavy. The cabin creaked under the storm's assault, the wind rattling the windows, a reminder of the world they'd left behind, and the one hunting them still. Daniel rose, pacing to the window, peering into the darkness beyond, his hands clenching into fists as he fought the urge to run, to fight, to protect. Lena watched him, her heart aching for the man who'd always been their rock, now crumbling under a weight he couldn't carry alone. Joel finished stitching, tying off the thread with a practiced knot, his hands lingering on Bruno's side as if willing the dog to hold on. Ethan curled closer, his small body a shield against the cold floor, his whispers a steady hum. "We're together, Bruno. We're safe." But safety was an illusion, a fleeting breath in the eye of the storm. And they all felt it. The shadow of Voss's men lurking beyond the trees, the ticking clock of a fight they couldn't avoid. The cabin held them for now, a fragile sanctuary stitched together with hope and desperation. But the night stretched on, dark and endless, and the road ahead loomed with a promise of more blood, more tears. The cabin's walls creaked under the storm's relentless assault, a fragile shell holding back the night as the wood stove cast a faint, flickering glow across the room. The air inside was thick with the scent of damp wool and antiseptic, a thin layer of warmth clinging to the edges of their exhaustion. Joel knelt by Bruno, his hands deft as he stitched the German Shepherd's wounds with a vet kit pulled from a battered duffel bag, the needle threading through torn flesh with a precision born of necessity. The dog's shallow breaths fogged the air, his massive frame sprawled across a blanket near the stove, his dark eyes half closed but alive, a testament to a will that refused to break. Ethan curled beside him, his small body pressed against the floor, his hand resting on Bruno's neck, a quiet anchor in the chaos they'd fled. Lena hovered nearby, her auburn hair plastered to her face, her hazel eyes tracing the lines of her son's small form, the way his curls clung to his forehead, still wet from the rain. She'd stripped off her soaked jacket, her hands trembling as she pulled a blanket from a cot to drape over Ethan's shoulders, her touch lingering as if she could shield him from the weight of the night. Daniel paced the room, his boots leaving muddy prints on the worn floorboards, his bloody hands clenching and unclenching as he took stock. Canned food on a shelf, a rifle leaning against the wall, a crumpled map tucked into a corner. The cabin was sparse but sturdy, a safe house Joel had carved out of the wilderness, but it felt less like salvation and more like a pause, a breath before the storm broke anew. "Voss won't stop," Joel warned, his voice low as he tied off a stitch, his fingers lingering on Bruno's side, feeling the faint thud of his heartbeat. He bandaged his own grazed arm with a strip of gauze, the blood seeping through from the chase, his dark eyes shadowed with a resolve that bordered on exhaustion. "He knows Bruno's alive. And me. I've got evidence to bury him, buried half a mile from here. We get it to the feds. He's done." His words were a lifeline, a thread of hope frayed by the reality pressing against them, and Daniel stopped pacing, his hazel eyes narrowing as he met Joel's gaze. "Then we go now," he said, his voice hard, a father's instinct to act, to protect, surging through the fear knotting his gut. "Not yet," Lena countered, her voice soft but firm as she knelt beside Ethan, her hand brushing his curls. "Bruno's too weak, and we're exhausted." She looked at the dog, his trembling form a mirror of their own fragility, and then at Joel, at Daniel, her eyes pleading for a moment to breathe, to gather the pieces of themselves scattered by the night. Joel nodded, a reluctant agreement in the set of his jaw, and they settled into a fitful rest. Daniel on a cot, Lena beside Ethan, Joel near the stove, his hands never far from Bruno. The fire crackled, a small comfort against the storm's distant growl, and for a fleeting hour they let the world wait, their breaths syncing with the dog's shallow rhythm. Midnight came with a jolt. Bruno's ears twitched, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest, his head lifting weakly from the blanket. Ethan woke instantly, his small hand tightening on Bruno's neck, his blue eyes wide with a fear that mirrored the dog's sudden alertness. "Someone's out there," he whispered, his voice trembling but sure, a certainty that sent a chill racing down Lena's spine. "Bruno smells them." Joel was on his feet in a heartbeat, the rifle snatched from the wall, his movements silent as he crossed to the window, peering through a crack in the blinds. His body tensed, a coiled spring ready to snap, and his voice dropped to a whisper, sharp and urgent. Shadows. 3, then more, circling the cabin. Voss's men. How? Daniel hissed, rising from the cot, his hands balling into fists as he joined Joel at the window, his heart hammering against his ribs. A GPS on the car, Joel realized, cursing under his breath, his dark eyes flashing with frustration. Must have planted it at your place when they knocked. The words landed like a blow, stripping away the illusion of safety, and Lena's breath caught, her arms wrapping around Ethan as she pulled him close, his small frame trembling against her chest. Bruno growled again, his ears pricked, his dark eyes narrowing as he struggled to rise, his stitched wounds pulling with the effort, a fierce loyalty burning through his pain. A heavy thud shook the front door, a deliberate strike that rattled the frame, and a voice sliced through the night, smooth, cold, dripping with menace. Joel, give me the dog and you walk away. It was Voss, his tone a velvet glove over a steel fist, and the words ignited a fire in Ethan's eyes, his small body stiffening in Lena's grasp. No! He cried, his voice a wail as he lunged toward Bruno, clinging to the dog's neck, his tears soaking into the matted fur. They can't take him! Lena held him tighter, her own tears welling as she whispered reassurances. We won't let them, baby, though her voice shook with a fear she couldn't hide. There's a tunnel, Joel said, his voice cutting through the panic as he flipped a rug near the stove, revealing a trapdoor carved into the floorboards. Storm cellar, 50 yards out. Take Bruno and go north to a waterfall cabin. I'll hold them off. He yanked the trapdoor open, the hinges groaning, a dank breath of earth rising from the darkness below. Lena's heart lurched, her eyes darting to Daniel, to Ethan, to Bruno, a family she couldn't bear to split. We're not leaving you, she protested, her voice breaking, her hands trembling as she gripped Ethan's shoulders. You have to, Joel insisted, his dark eyes meeting hers with a fierce, unyielding resolve. He scooped Bruno up, the dog's weight straining his arms, and started toward the trapdoor, but Bruno twisted, planting his paws against Joel's chest, his teeth bared in a weak snarl as he refused to budge. He staggered to the floor, his legs trembling, and positioned himself beside Joel, facing the door with a loyalty that broke Lena's heart. Ethan sobbed, his small hands reaching for the dog. He won't leave you, he cried, his voice a desperate plea that echoed in the cabin's hollow space. The door splintered with a deafening crack, wood shards flying as Voss's men breached the threshold. Joel fired a warning shot, the rifle's report a thunderclap that shook the walls, the bullet embedding in the doorframe with a spray of splinters. Go! He shouted, his voice a raw command as he braced himself, Bruno growling beside him, a battered guardian ready to fight. Daniel lunged for Lena and Ethan, dragging them toward the trapdoor, his hands shaking as he pushed them into the darkness below. Lena stumbled down the wooden steps, Ethan in her arms, his sobs muffled against her shoulder as the trapdoor slammed shut above them, sealing them in with a thud that felt final. The tunnel was dank and narrow, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and mold, lit only by the faint beam of Daniel's keychain flashlight. The wooden beams overhead sagged, dripping water onto their heads, and the muffled sounds of gunfire erupted above. Sharp cracks, shouts, the chaos of a battle they'd left behind. Ethan's tears soaked Lena's shirt, his small voice echoing in the tight space. Bruno, he whimpered, his hands clutching her as if he could pull the dog through the earth to them. He's fighting for us. Lena's throat tightened, her own tears falling as she held him close, her whispers a desperate comfort. He's strong, baby. He's strong. Though her heart ached with the fear that they'd lost him already. Daniel led the way, his flashlight shaking as he navigated the tunnel, his broad shoulders brushing the walls, his breath coming in sharp gasps. 50 yards stretched like a lifetime, the earth pressing in around them, the sounds of the fight fading to a haunting murmur. They reached a ladder at the end, rough-hewn and slick with moisture, and Daniel climbed first, pushing open a hatch that spilled cold rain onto his face. He pulled Lena and Ethan up after him, their bodies collapsing into the forest floor, mud and leaves clinging to their skin as smoke rose in the distance. The cabin burning, flames licking the night sky through the trees. Lena clutched Ethan, her arms trembling as she looked back, her hazel eyes wide with a grief she couldn't voice. The gunfire had stopped, replaced by the crackle of fire, and she prayed. Prayed Joel and Bruno had escaped, prayed they'd find them again. Ethan's small hand gripped hers, his voice a whisper against the storm. "Bruno said, 'Trust Daddy,'" he said, his blue eyes shimmering with tears and a faith that broke her heart. "He'll meet us at the waterfall." Daniel pulled them north, his arms around them both, and they stumbled on, the forest a dark embrace hiding them from the hunters left behind. The tunnel spat them out into the forest's damp embrace, the hatch slamming shut behind them as rain pelted their faces, a cold lash against skin already numb from fear. Lena clutched Ethan to her chest, her arms trembling as she sank into the mud, leaves and twigs clinging to her soaked jeans. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and pine, the storm's growl a distant rumble now, overshadowed by the faint crackle of flames in the distance, the cabin burning, a fiery scar against the night sky. Daniel knelt beside them, his breath coming in sharp gasps, his keychain flashlight flickering as he scanned the trees, his broad shoulders hunched against the weight of what they'd left behind. Ethan's small body shook in Lena's grasp, his sobs muffled against her shoulder, his yellow raincoat torn and streaked with mud, a remnant of the boy who'd faced a train for a dog he'd never met. "They're out!" Lena gasped, her voice breaking as she caught a glimpse through the trees, two figures leaping from the cabin's window, silhouettes against the orange glow of fire. Joel and Bruno fleeing into the forest as gunfire cracked behind them, bullets tearing through the night like vengeful wasps. She strained to see more, her hazel eyes wide with hope and dread, but the trees swallowed them, the flames and smoke blurring the scene into a nightmare she couldn't unsee. Ethan pulled back, his small face pale, his blue eyes brimming with tears as he looked toward the chaos. "We have to help," he begged, his voice a desperate plea, his hands reaching out as if he could pull Bruno back to them through sheer will. Daniel's heart twisted, a father's instinct warring with the reality pressing against them. Voss's men, the fire, the distance between them and the ones they'd left behind. "Bruno said, 'Trust Daddy,'" Ethan whispered, his words trembling but sure, a faith that pierced Daniel's chest like a blade. "He'll meet us at the waterfall." The boy's certainty anchored them, a lifeline in the storm's wreckage, and Daniel nodded, his voice rough as he pulled Lena and Ethan to their feet. "North," he said, his arm around them both, guiding them through the forest's tangled embrace. "We keep moving." The trek stretched through the night, an endless march of mud and shadow, stream gurgling to their left, waterfall roaring ahead, cabin promised but unseen. Lena carried Ethan when his small legs faltered, his weight warm against her chest, his arms wrapped around her neck as his whispers faded to exhausted murmurs. "Bruno's coming. He's coming." Her own strength waned, her sneakers sinking into the soft earth, her breath clouding in the cold, but she pushed on, driven by the image of her son's tear-streaked face, by the dog who'd called him into this storm. Daniel led, his flashlight dimming, his hands bloody and trembling as he parted branches, his eyes scanning the darkness for threats, for hope, for anything to keep them alive. Dawn broke gray and weak, the rain easing to a drizzle as they reached the waterfall, a cascade of silver tumbling into a rocky pool, the hunter's cabin perched on its bank like a forgotten relic. They stumbled inside, the wooden walls damp and creaking, the air stale with disuse. Lena collapsed onto a bench, Ethan in her lap, his small body curling into her as she wrapped the blanket tighter around him, her hands shaking with fatigue and fear. Daniel sank beside her, his head in his hands, his breath ragged as he fought the urge to go back, to find Joel and Bruno, to end this nightmare with his own fists. "They'll make it," he whispered, more to himself than to them, a prayer against the silence that pressed in around them. But Daniel couldn't stay still. His heart wouldn't let him. He slipped out, retracing their path, his boots crunching on wet leaves as he tracked Joel and Bruno through the forest, his flashlight flickering with the last of its life. The river came into view, its banks swollen from the storm, and there they were. Joel leaning against a tree, blood seeping from a gash on his leg, Bruno sprawled beside him, barely standing, his stitched wounds reopened, blood dripping into the mud. Daniel's breath caught, relief and dread crashing over him as he ran to them, dropping to his knees beside the dog. "You're alive!" he choked out, his hands hovering over Bruno's trembling form, afraid to touch, afraid to break what little strength remained. Joel's face was pale, his dark eyes shadowed with pain as he pressed a hand to his leg, staunching the blood. "Barely," he rasped, his voice rough with exhaustion. "They hit us hard. ATVs, guns. Bruno let us out." The dog's ears twitched at his name, his head lifting weakly, his dark eyes searching the trees as if he knew Ethan was waiting. Voss's men were close, too close, the rumble of engines echoing through the forest, a relentless hunt drawing nearer with every second. "We can't stay," Joel said, forcing himself up, his leg buckling as he leaned on Daniel for support. Bruno staggered to his feet, his legs trembling, a low whine escaping his throat as he pressed forward, driven by a will that defied his broken body. Daniel half-carried Joel, Bruno limping beside them, his blood leaving a trail in the mud as they pushed toward the river's edge. The German shepherd paused, his nose twitching, then veered toward a tangle of vines, a hidden cave, its entrance masked by nature's curtain. "He knows," Daniel muttered, awe threading through his fear as Bruno plunged into the darkness, his paws splashing through shallow water. They followed, the cave's dank air wrapping around them, the sound of the river fading as an underground stream glimmered ahead. Bruno swam, his head barely above the surface, guiding them through twisting passages. Narrow, slick, the walls pressing in like a tomb, until sunlight pierced the gloom, a cavern opening miles from where they'd started. They emerged into a clearing, exhausted but alive, the waterfall's distant roar a beacon calling them home. Bruno faltered, his legs giving out as he sank into the grass, his breath a faint wheeze, his dark eyes flickering with a fading light. Daniel and Joel stumbled toward the sound, Bruno dragging himself behind, his blood staining the earth with every step. Ethan's cry, "Daddy!" rang out as they neared the cabin, the boy bursting from the door, Lena close behind, her face crumpling with relief and terror as she saw them. Ethan ran to Bruno, dropping to his knees beside the dog, his small hands sinking into the matted fur as tears streamed down his cheeks. But Voss found them. His shadow loomed from the trees, a pistol gleaming in his hand, his smooth voice dripping with venom. "You should have given me the dog, Joel." The words were a taunt, a prelude to violence, and Joel lunged, his injured leg slowing him as Voss fired, a shot grazing his arm, sending him sprawling. Bruno surged forward, a snarl tearing from his throat, his battered body a blur as he tackled Voss, teeth sinking into the man's wrist. The gun clattered to the ground, Voss's shout of pain swallowed by the dog's fierce growl, and Daniel seized the moment, pinning Voss with a fist to his jaw as Joel scrambled for the weapon. Sirens wailed in the distance, help, finally, drawn by the smoke and chaos. And Voss's men faltered, retreating into the trees as the sound grew closer. Bruno collapsed, his strength spent, his body slumping into Ethan's arms as the boy sobbed, his small hands cradling the dog's head. "You saved us," he whispered, his voice breaking, tears falling onto Bruno's blood-streaked fur. The German shepherd's eyes met his, dark and deep, a final flicker of trust, of love, shimmering in their depths. His tongue brushed Ethan's hand, a weak, fleeting lick, and then his breath stilled, his massive frame going limp as his spirit slipped away, free at last from the pain that had bound him. Ethan's wail tore through the clearing, a sound so raw it seemed to shake the earth, and Lena fell beside him, her arms wrapping around her son as her own sobs joined his, their grief a shared wound bleeding into the dawn. Daniel sank to his knees, his hands trembling as he touched Bruno's still form, his hazel eyes brimming with tears he couldn't hold back. Joel staggered over, blood dripping from his arm, his face etched with a sorrow that went beyond words. "He fought till the end," he murmured, his voice rough, breaking, a tribute to the dog who'd given everything. The sirens grew louder, police bursting into the clearing, Voss subdued and cuffed, his empire crumbling in the wake of Bruno's final stand. But the victory was hollow, overshadowed by the loss that weighed on them, a silence where Bruno's breath had been. Ethan clung to Bruno, his small body shaking, his whispers a litany against the grief. "You're my hero, Bruno. You're my hero." Lena held him, her tears soaking his curls, her heart aching for the dog who'd called her son into the storm, who'd saved them with a courage she'd never forget. Daniel pulled them close, his arms a shield around his family, and they wept together. The waterfall's roar, a mournful hymn to a soul that had burned so brightly, now gone. Weeks had passed since that storm-swept night, but the echoes of it lingered in the Carter family like a shadow stitched into their souls. Voss was gone, cuffed and jailed, his empire dismantled by the evidence Joel had buried in the forest, unearthed and delivered to the FBI in the days that followed Bruno's sacrifice. The headlines screamed of corruption and cruelty, a private security kingpin brought low. But for the Carters, the victory was a hollow thing, drowned out by the silence where Bruno's breath had been. They'd left Willow Creek behind, the house by the tracks too heavy with memories, of blood on the kitchen table, of gunfire in the night, to hold them any longer. A new town welcomed them, a quiet place with rolling hills and wide skies, a fresh start carved from the wreckage of what they'd lost. But Ethan was a shadow of himself, a flicker of the boy who'd once chased storms and whispered to the stars. His blonde curls hung limp, his blue eyes dulled by a grief that clung to him like damp earth. He moved through the days in silence, his small hands empty without Bruno's fur to stroke, his laughter a memory Lena couldn't coax back no matter how she tried. She watched him from the kitchen window of their new home, her auburn hair tied back, her hazel eyes tracing his small figure as he sat on the porch steps, staring at nothing, lost in a world where Bruno still ran beside him. Daniel felt it too. His broad shoulders slumped as he tinkered in the garage, his tools a distraction from the ache in his chest, from the guilt of a father who couldn't shield his son from such a loss. Lena kneaded dough on the counter, her hands moving through the familiar rhythm, the scent of yeast and flour a fragile thread to normalcy. She'd bake bread, she'd told herself, something warm, something alive, to fill the house with a comfort they all craved. But her eyes kept drifting to Ethan, to the way his small shoulders hunched, and her throat tightened with tears she'd thought she'd cried out. "He'll come back to us," Daniel had said that morning, his voice rough with hope he didn't fully feel, his hand squeezing hers before he'd slipped out to the garage. But Lena wasn't so sure. Ethan's light had dimmed with Bruno's last breath, and she feared it might never flare again. The crunch of gravel broke her reverie, a familiar pickup rolling into the driveway. Joel, his lean frame stepping out, his dark eyes shadowed but softer now, the weight of survival etched into his stubbled face. He'd healed, mostly, the gash on his leg a scar, the graze on his arm faded. But he carried Bruno's loss like a quiet burden, a debt he couldn't repay. Lena wiped her hands on a towel, her heart lifting slightly as she opened the door, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Joel," she said, her voice warm despite the ache beneath it, and he nodded, a faint smile of his own breaking through the exhaustion. "Got something for Ethan," he said, his voice rough but gentle, and he stepped aside, revealing a small crate in the truck bed. A puppy peered out, Black and tan fur, serious eyes, a tilt of the head that tugged at Lena's memory, stirring a pang so sharp she pressed a hand to her chest. "His name's Hero," Joel said, lifting the crate down, the pup's small paws scrabbling against the wood. "Found him at a shelter. Same bloodline as Bruno, I'd bet my life on it. Thought Ethan might need him." His words faltered, thick with emotion, and Lena's eyes welled, her hand reaching for the crate as tears blurred her vision. She called Ethan in, her voice trembling as he shuffled to the door, his small frame hesitant, his blue eyes wary until they landed on the pup. Joel set the crate down, opening the latch, and Hero tumbled out, small, unsteady but bold, his serious gaze locking with Ethan's. The boy froze, his breath hitching, and then he sank to his knees, his small hands outstretched as Hero padded toward him, sniffing, then licking his fingers with a tentative wag of his tail. "Bruno says goodnight," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking, tears spilling down his cheeks as he pulled the pup close, burying his face in the soft fur. Lena's knees buckled, and she knelt beside him, her arms wrapping around her son and Hero, her sobs mingling with his as the weight of loss and hope crashed over them. Daniel emerged from the garage, his tools forgotten, his hazel eyes widening as he took in the scene, Ethan cradling Hero, Lena holding them both, Joel standing back with a quiet, pained pride. He crossed the yard in long strides, dropping beside them, his broad hand resting on Ethan's back, feeling the boy's trembling ease under the pup's warmth. "He's like him," Ethan said, his voice small but alive, a spark flickering back into his eyes as Hero nuzzled his chin. "He's from Bruno." Daniel nodded, his throat tight, his own tears threatening as he brushed a hand over Hero's fur, feeling a piece of Bruno in the pup's steady gaze. Months slipped by, and the new town became home. Bread baked in the oven, laughter echoing through the yard, Hero growing into his paws beside Ethan. The pup was serious, watchful, a guardian in the making, and Ethan's light returned, his curls bouncing as he ran with Hero across the hills, his voice calling out commands Bruno had once known. Lena watched from the porch, her heart swelling with a fragile joy. The scars of that night softening Trungtum Muasum still lingered. Nights when Ethan woke crying, days when Hero's bark startled them all. But they healed, slowly, together. Daniel built a swing set in the yard, his hands steady now, his laughter mingling with Ethan's as Hero chased butterflies, a shadow of Bruno in every leap. In one twilight, under an oak tree that stretched wide and old over their new yard, Ethan sat with Hero, his small hand resting on the pup's fur, his blue eyes tracing the stars beginning to prick the sky. "Bruno's watching," he said, his voice soft, sure, a wisdom beyond his years shimmering in his gaze. "He's proud of us." Daniel joined him, sitting beside his son on the grass, his arm around Ethan's shoulders, feeling the breeze stir the leaves, a whisper, a presence, a brave soul shining on. Lena stepped out, her auburn hair catching the fading light, and sat with them, her hand finding Daniel's, their fingers lacing together as Hero settled at their feet, his serious eyes glinting with a spark of the past. They stayed there, a family bound by loss and love, the stars a canopy above them, each one a piece of Bruno's legacy, courage in the dark, light in the sorrow. Ethan leaned against Daniel, his small voice a murmur against the night. "Hero's my friend, but Bruno's my hero," he said, and Lena's tears fell silently, her heart full with a grief that had softened, a hope that had grown. The oak rustled, the stars burned, and in that quiet moment, they felt him, Bruno, their guardian, their star, watching over them still.